So Katie was asking a question in regards to resilience and planning with regards to previous crises in 2011 or 1989, where severe weather has also had an effect on power supply. And she was wondering if those events informed current emergency preparedness for the state, and to what extent this unique management of the Texan electrical grid with ERCOT impact the state's ability to be resilient against critical infrastructure loss and the cascading effects of disasters would be. And I would give that to the panel, whoever wants to go first. I don't know if Dr. Jones wants to has some insight into this first.
Sure. So the unique nature of the Texas energy grid, and I don't claim to be an expert on this, but there have been many things that have been identified very quickly. One, there's a fundamental problem of winterization. There was no incentive built into the system to winterize. Also, the limited power sharing. My understanding is that there is some power sharing, but it's quite limited. And as a result of that, that can lead to a situation in which the system might have been more resilient had it been able to purchase power from other portions of the grid around the country. More broadly, there's a broader issue I would like to talk about at some point, which is that we haven't spent on infrastructure in this country in quite some time. The 1930s and 40s, and I had family members who got jobs with the WPA in that period. These were people who were willing to work and were suddenly out of work in the Great Depression, and there was massive infrastructure buildup. I went to a middle school, and the building was more than 100 years old. And in the auditorium was this beautiful artwork, sculptures that had been done by artists employed by the WPA during the 1930s. Really amazing projects. And we built a lot of infrastructure in this country in the 1930s. And we built a lot of infrastructure in this country, particularly in terms of transportation infrastructure with the interstate highway system in the 1950s under Eisenhower. And what paid for much of that was a very high progressive income tax system. People don't realize that in the 1950s, if you look at the tax structure in the United States, the top 1% or the top marginal tax rate was in the 90% range. And people hear that and they get this shocked. Now, nobody ever paid that. There were deductions that were very broad, but they paid higher rates than they do now. We made large investments in infrastructure. We have been living on borrowed infrastructure for quite some time in this country. The United States brings in about 26% of GDP in taxation. The OECD average is at least 34%. And when you look at countries that I study, like Mexico, which is only at 16%, various Central American countries, which are down to 12 and 14%, at some point you start to notice a pattern, which is taxation is important. You need functioning law enforcement. You need which we fortunately have. We have very good law enforcement and court systems, but we haven't been making long-term investments in infrastructure. And so we had to take a step back and say, well, our emergency managers did great in the moment with the situation that they had, but why were they in the situation that they had? Why? Why was there a shortage of power? Now, understanding that the Texas electrical grid is cut off from most of the rest of the country in most ways, it's not completely cut off, but in most ways, you can make a homeland security argument for compartmentation or from architectural theory. You've all seen the scene in the submarine movie where they're cutting off a section of the submarine to prevent and sacrificing one portion of the submarine to prevent the rest of the submarine from sinking. You have fire doors in buildings to compartment and cut off danger from one portion of another to another. So we could imagine, say, a hack that hits the American electrical grid. Having a compartmented portion of the grid could have value. But in this case, it seems to have made the whole system far less resilient in the sense that it couldn't engage in power sharing. And so, once upon a time in the 1950s, there were presidential campaigns that talked about a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. Well, we could have solar panels on every roof, an electric battery with 2 to 3 days of power storage in every home, an electric car in every garage, and we could have and invest in power storage capability. And that is one thing that is really interesting. People think Tesla is a car company. It's not. It's an energy company. That's the big idea. The idea of power storage and creating a more resilient grid or a more resilient power storage system. That's going to require also massive investments in some kind of a smart grid system in which it's easier to handle transfers of power in different ways. And I'm not an electrical engineer. So, I mean, I'm not going to be able to go into those details, but we know that we're going to need to make those investments. But the way I look at it is those could be champagne problems. Whereas if we have a distributed power system that is more resilient, then our problem will become, well, how do we prevent the grid operators from going out of business? Because we're still going to need a grid. But that becomes a champagne problem. How are we going to regulate the system so that we can make sure that grid operators stay in business, despite the fact that we're generating enough power in a decentralized fashion that we can create a more resilient grid? So imagine I lose power to my house. Well, my home battery kicks on because it's been powered up and stored because of the solar panels on my roof that have been storing power. That would make the whole system a lot more resilient. And there are a lot of ways, and I'd be happy to talk about how to fund that and we can go into that, but I don't want to monopolize too much time. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. I would be interested in what Professor Emmett would say to this, if he thinks like how Texas has been resilient in the power grid.
Well, let me pick up on some of what Dr. Jones said. As a former Republican legislator, I'm perhaps as aware as anybody of the no new taxes approach in Texas. The problem with that is, and I will say it bluntly, if everybody runs for office every election saying, I'm going to lower your taxes, well, once the party's been in power for a quarter of a century, there's nothing left to lower. And in fact, whether you're talking about the gasoline tax, the funding of highways, moving to a different tax, the fact that now the state is trying to limit how much cities and counties rely only on a property tax, and you can't keep doing that. I mean, there's the old saying about, you keep cutting and cutting and cutting, and eventually you're cutting into the bone, and that's where we are. And people have got to admit that in Texas. Now, the answer to it with regard to the electrical grid was more of an out of sight, out of mind philosophy. Both parties, I will say, got convinced that we had to do away with the monopolies in electric power. We used to have Houston Lighting and Power in Houston. They did everything. They generated, they supplied, they distributed. And then that was bad. That led to the creation of the Public Utility Commission. Suddenly, cogeneration had to be part of the system. Wind power had to be part of the system. And everybody thought this is going to be great. And then on the Republican side, the conservative side, people said, oh, deregulation is going to be great because it's going to lower the cost of electricity. Well, without getting into all the economics of it, the competition might have driven down the rate, but what it did was it cut off the incentive to invest in backup power. And so what we had and what we have now is a system that's not at all resilient and doesn't have the backup generation capacity. And a lot of people sign contracts for marginal rates that could skyrocket. I believe the high got to be $9,000 per megawatt. And so now the state Senate's saying, oh, no, that's horrible. We can't make people pay that. Well, you set it up that way. So if a company signed contracts based on that, can you go abrogate all those contracts? So I think, what Dr. Jones said was right. We have just kind of ignored infrastructure, and we've been living on borrowed time for a long time. And so this is just one example. It's not just in this, it's in roads and bridges and everything else in the state of Texas. So we're gonna have to invest, and unless somebody can produce a ferry that's going to come down from on high and grace us with a lot of money to rebuild our infrastructure in Texas, then we're going to be in trouble for a while. Hate to admit that.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Emmett.
Sorry.
Of course. No, Dr. Jones, the floor is yours.
Brief comment. We talk so much about polarization. I'm sorry, Tami. We talk so much about polarization in our country, but I'm pretty liberal, and Professor Emmett's a conservative, and we can agree on this. So if we can agree on this, I'm very, very hopeful about where our country can go very soon. And so, Tami, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to chime in real quick on that.
I don't claim to know anything about infrastructures and electrical infrastructure, but there's two things that I know has happened down in here in South Texas because of this. One is we've had a lot of wind power. We put in a lot of the wind power has become huge down here. And my understanding is wind power failed during this whole process. It was not able to generate the electricity that was needed. That's what I've heard down here. The other was that we have in the city of Brownsville, we have a public utilities board, and they actually had a generator that was on kind of mothballs, and they took it out of mothballs and actually did produce electricity and sold that back. Now the representatives that are elected to that board for the Public Utilities Board are very, very concerned, because if the public finds out that electricity didn't come to the city of Brownsville, which was without power for several days, but they actually sold it somewhere else, they're concerned that they may not themselves either get reelected to their position or reappointed to that position, because they made that decision that, to go ahead and reactivate this generator and to sell power because it was needed to be sold, but it didn't go to the citizens of Brownsville, which is where it resides. Those are just two comments they may be true or not true. So,
Dr. Jones.
Real quick. So while some wind turbines definitely did fail, wind turbines can function quite well in cold weather environments. We know that they work in the Netherlands. They can be winterized. And it is my understanding that natural gas power plants and nuclear power plants also suffered significant setbacks due to a lack of winterization. So I think that this is a broader issue on the issue of winterization than just wind turbines and versus natural gas versus nuclear. They all across the board could have been winterized and were not. And I'll pitch it to Professor.
Good. Yes, they could have all been winterized. And when people study what happened, the South Texas nuclear project went down. For whatever reason, I don't know. I've not been able to figure that out. But South Texas nuclear project is, I believe, like 80% jointly owned by San Antonio and Austin. And so that immediately caused a problem in those two areas. The wind turbines, and I confess I'm not a big fan of wind generated energy, but they are not expected. The grid has to take whatever they provide. But in the case of winter, I want to say that it's cut way back as to what they're supposed to provide. All systems failed. The gas failed. And not only the gas generating plants, but the gas system itself that was to provide the gas to the gas generating plants in the gas fields. And so the whole thing was not winterized, but there was no incentive to. You've got to get back to the fact that if everything is going to be on the lowest cost basis, and you own a business and you're competing with other businesses, the first thing you're going to do is not pay extra for things like winterization and backup generation. That's the issue that's got to be addressed. Somehow that's got to be built into the rates going forward so that companies that supply the power have an incentive to have backup power.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Emmett. Going back to response just a little bit, or really quickly, posing this to Randall, Tami, being responders yourselves, as well as both Professor Emmett and Dr. Jones being able to kind of just watch everything happen over the course of that week. Did we have the resources necessary to even address this disaster in the first place? You guys touched a little bit on future proofing, winterization, and going into whether or not you guys had resources now, what can be done for the future?
This is Randall over at Collin County. I personally don't feel like we had the resources at the time of need. We have generators all across the state. We have access to generators all across the state. We have access to water all across the state. Judge Emmett, Professor Emmett's been through this numerous times in a hurricane. That stuff is surged into our state and into our regions days ahead. We don't even really think about it. It's there. Yep, you may have to wait a few hours to get that generator or that water, but you know it's coming. This event, that stuff wasn't here for whatever reason. And then when it was here, wasn't where it was needed. And then you couldn't move it on the roads because a lot of the roads were impassable due to snow and ice and everything else on the roads. Other thing that came up, you weren't able to move them. Diesel engines gelled over because we don't use winter fuel down here like they do up north. So I don't feel like we had the resources where we needed them. I think that was for multiple reasons. I think it was we all went into this as, oh, it's going to be cold, it's going to be snowy. We're not going to be able to leave our house for a few days. We may lose power a few times because they were talking, the blackouts, rolling. And we're going to be good to go. And to chime off to that, even Sunday night, ERCOT, put out a tweet. Max, highest winter demand ever. We made it through. We're good to go. Everything's, looking good. And our electric co-op even said we've sent our staff home because we're not going to have to do the rolling blackouts. Well, then the power generation failed for lots of reasons, as has been discussed. So I think the way we assumed our planning and went into this, we did not have the right resources in the right places. And on that note, I think it's hard to know where those resources needed to be. If I can't move a generator even 15 miles, I don't know which water pumps are going to fail. We had no way to know where exactly those were going to need to be. Now, could we have got them down to a county level? Yes, but outside of that, it was anybody's guess. So from my point of view, the resources are there, but they weren't in the right place at the right time. And then I'm going to go to, kind of what Dr. Jones said. And I'll admit, I tend to be on the conservative side, but I totally agree with him. We shouldn't even had to be dealing with these things if the infrastructure was maintained and supported correctly over the years.
And thank you, Randall. Tami, from the NGO side, would you like to add anything about the Red Cross and whether y'all had the resources or even support or not only support, but working conjointly with FEMA?
Yeah, there's a lot of pre-planning that goes into a lot of disaster preparedness. I mean, that is definitely something that we do continuously, and we do have resources available. But when you get into catastrophic events such as this type of event, those resources become extremely precious. And then if you get into the issue of you can't move stuff, and we saw that in Hurricane Harvey was another big problem. We could get the stuff to the state line, but we couldn't get it across the river because of the flooding and those type of things. So when you can't move the stuff, even though you've got the best plans in the world and you've got stuff, you just can't get it to where it needs to be. And you end up being very, very creative on how you get things moved. I didn't consider, but I have in Harvey, I ended up using helicopters to move water out to Galveston Island because they needed water and we couldn't get it over there. And that was how I got my people and my water out there. We never got to that level of having that kind of a discussion. We were able to eventually get water once we got it into the state and could get out and start working with the counties. We were able to get the water there.
Let me follow up on that with regard. I was sort of in the middle of Harvey. The state system failed not because of anything the state did. Harvey made landfall south down toward Corpus Christi. Mm-hmm. So the state sent their resources there. And by the time people realized Harvey, when it got to the Houston area and Beaumont area, wasn't a hurricane, it was just a flood event. Mm-hmm. Well, we know where to evacuate and what to do with a hurricane because you know where the storm surge is. But when the whole area is getting 50 inches of rain, you have no idea even where to set up shelters. The Red Cross, no offense, weren't helpful at all because they're a volunteer organization and their people were all trapped. Mm-hmm. So, we had to cobble together things. But my favorite example of it was I got a call from a county judge, 2 counties north of Harris County, saying, we have some people trapped in an elementary school. They don't have any cots. They don't have any MREs, meals ready to eat. They have water, but we'd rather have some bottled water. We don't have any blankets. We don't have any supplies. And we can't get through to the state. Can you get through to them? And I said, well, it won't do you any good because the state can't come help us. So I turned to my logistics manager and I said, you handle this. And her solution was a Harris County truck just took a wrong turn and ended up 2 counties north with supplies from Harris County. Did I have the authority to do that? No. Was it the right thing to do? Absolutely. And so she got all kinds of gold stars in my book for just taking it upon herself and helping a neighbor. Well, fast forward to this event. It's a totally different event. And politics being what politics are, I can guarantee you, if there had been another administration, people would have been yelling, where's FEMA? Where's FEMA? Where's FEMA? We didn't hear any of that. But I asked the question, where was FEMA? They weren't here. Now, it was a new administration. There wasn't even a named person in charge of DHS. But the example I gave was, after the fact, what was really needed in Houston was copper tubing because of all the water breaks. FEMA could have done great by just setting up a place for the plumbers to come get copper tubing to fix the water breaks, but that's not in the playbook anywhere. So one of the things we have to do is make sure that the playbook, and to all the students here, if you end up in this business, stay flexible. Don't get so wrapped up in, well, gee, all I deliver are MREs and water and ice. No, sometimes it's going to be copper tubing that needs to be delivered. And that would have helped us a lot. So in my personal situation, I told you we had a pipe break. I went to Victoria, and Victoria had all kinds of copper tubing. So all we had to do was realize what's the need and then match that need up with where the supplies are. And nobody was doing that. And that's a job that FEMA really should do.